Darren, there's a question for you next, really. Were travellers interviewed in the survey? It was an interesting question.
Yes. Hi. We took particular efforts to boost the survey in two areas, in terms of lesbian, gays and bisexuals, and also in terms of black and minority ethnic groups. Travellers would have been included within that wider black and minority ethnic group boosting of the sample, but we wouldn't have got individual numbers of each of the subgroups to be able to say anything specific about them. So yes, they're in there, but can we drill down to them in this particular survey? Probably not.
Another question from Charmaine Jones from the Rural Community Network. In terms of the findings, Darren, did you find any discrepancies or comparisons between rural and urban? I mean, obviously you have the east and west divide, but how have attitudes changed for those living in villages and communities outside Belfast?
Yeah, well, as some of the slides that I showed earlier demonstrated, we've taken the breakdown of those in Belfast, those in the east that aren't in Belfast, and those in west. We didn't actually use a rural-urban breakdown for the analysis, but the data was collected on the basis of postcode, so if there's an interest in looking at something like that, then it's maybe a conversation we can have.
Just going to some of the other people on the panel now. I'll go not in chronological order with these, but Fidelma, this is an interesting one for you. If someone identifies as LGBT and does not want to be identified, how do we take forward their complaint? And obviously this is a big issue for people from any of the sectors or any of the groups that we're talking about, because it is that step of bravery to front up and say, well, look, I'm complaining because of A, B or C.
It's difficult, but certainly not impossible. Certainly the likes of, if it's a work-related issue, you can take it up through a trade union, and certainly I've been able to take up issues on behalf of individuals, but in a more collective manner, because someone didn't want their sexual orientation disclosed. But we were able to work with management very closely to look at what the issue was that happened and what management was going to do to try and promote a more positive culture. I mean, there's also people can still put in a written complaint, and again say that there's an issue and identify and say, I am not in a position to identify. It's a bit like name and address withheld in the letter to the editor. But this is an issue, and I would like it looked at in some way. The challenge is that the person or the individual or the organisation that's been accused, they also have rights, and they have a right to know, because with any process, when there's a complaint is made, there has to be an investigation of the complaint. So you have to see, was it valid? Was it what was the person's perception? What actually happened? Did the organisation or business or whatever? How did they respond? And usually you would go through a very rigorous investigation process where you would talk to all the parties involved, and you would make an adjudication based on the evidence that you were received. Where someone isn't in a position to identify themselves and isn't in a position to then be able to be followed up in terms of those questions that you may want to ask, that is difficult. But I think if you go to the business organisation and say, we've received a complaint on these grounds, they may deny it. They may also know that because the individual hasn't identified themselves individually, they can't be taken to industrial tribunal if they're an organisation, or the Consumer Council if they're a business. But for them to know that somebody is talking about them negatively, then it's important, whether they're a business or an organisation, to respond to that, even in a corporate way. I mean, Evelyn, you might want, in terms of the legal elements, rights that people might have.
Yes, it's one of the concerns we have, that despite the introduction of legislation to protect people on the grounds of sexual orientation in respect of employment and training first, and then the provision of goods and services and facilities, there still isn't a great number of complaints coming forward, either to the Commission or into the industrial tribunal system. We did some research on that, actually in partnership with the Equality Authority in the South a few years ago, to look at the reasons why that is. One of the explanations is that people are not out and don't want to be very public about that, despite the fact that they have serious concerns about workplace treatment. But there's other areas also, including the whole question of the kind of public nature of industrial tribunal forums. So we have talked to the industrial tribunals about privacy in relation to some of those cases, and that's happened in some cases around a gendered person, not in relation to sexual orientation, and that's, I think, a real issue, looking at some of the obstacles to complaints that we still need to work on. And again, this survey is helpful in that context of showing where some of the concerns around poor treatment lie.
Malachy, this one, I mean, anybody can answer on this, but just it is
Yeah.
a sort of specific media one. But if we come to
Yeah.
you first, 30% negative attitudes towards travellers, as we've heard. What does the panel think is the effect of programmes like Big Fat Gypsy Weddings? A really good question.
I've never seen it. But I think, I mean, I would be very interested as well, though, in hearing the answer to where people do pick up most of their impressions from. And I suspect that they pick them up mostly from peer groups. And there is a paradox that Francis alluded to, that you know, whereas we do assume, or I think very strongly, that most people's prejudice is about people they don't know. You know, we do all know people who are gay. We do all know people who've experienced being mentally ill. I have never, to my knowledge, had a member of the travelling community in my home. I would imagine that most of us haven't. I don't know. I have a prejudice, if you like, I can own up to. I mean, there was an incident not long ago when some people from a travelling community were collecting in my street, and one of my neighbours said to the woman collecting things, "Oh, we might not be in when you come back, but we'll put a bag on the doorstep for you and you can collect it." And someone else said, "Are you out of your mind? You've just notified the travellers that you will have a sign at your door to say there's nobody in." And I, you know, there was a debate: is this a prejudicial understanding of the situation, or is it a realistic one? So I referred to a member of the RUC whom I was training with, who had relations with the travelling community, and I said, "Well, was this an exercise in bigotry?" And he said, no, in his opinion, it was an exercise in practical good sense. So there's complexities within this issue. We do not, any of us have sufficiently, or many of us have a sufficiently intimate interaction with members of the travelling community to know those that are. To know the diversity of attitudes and behaviours and cultures within that. And that's what we do need to get to break down the assumption that anyone who is a traveller is going to fleece you or rob you. And how do we get that? We may get it through programmes like, I don't know, the particular one, Big Fat Gypsy Wedding. We certainly need to get it from somewhere, and we can't entirely rely on ethnic groups, cultural groups, to project their own image, to take full responsibility for the projection of their own image, to monopolise corners of the media in which to state their own case exclusively themselves. So, so does that?
Yeah, because it is. It's an interesting point, because you said in your talk at the start about drama and other forums, and obviously this is a kind of drama documentary, if you like, and in some ways some people might argue that it's been a good thing because it has maybe softened people's attitudes in some ways, but in other ways it's kind of a parody and it's kind of a nonsensical approach. It's very difficult. I mean, George, is there a role for the police? Because the other thing from a media point of view tends to be that, as Malachy was just saying there, when we do have coverage of people from the traveller community, it does tend to be in involvement with crime if it's not something to do with schooling or something to do with what they're actually looking for in terms of housing and sites and so on.
Well, I think it comes back to Fidelma's initial comment about let's find a robust evidence base for this stuff, because actually people are much more likely to have their house burgled or be involved in some sort of a scam by a member of society who is not a member of the travelling community. Now, that's not to say that there's no crime that emanates from the travelling community, but we actually have crime coming from all quarters. And part of this is about a lack of understanding and a lack of relationship. And Malachy's point about we actually, generally speaking, excuse me for stereotyping, but generally speaking, the rest of us don't engage with the travelling community, and that's partly to do with the culture within the travelling community, about them being quite internally focused and their own cultural norms, which perhaps isn't as embracing and reaching out to the rest of us. So that lack of knowledge, that ignorance, which breeds prejudice, just continues to grow. But it's also a reality to say that there are certain crime types that travelling community, because of their lifestyle and so on, will be attracted to. But actually, if you did analysis in all crime types across all groups in society, you would find other patterns that would develop that we don't seem to get hung up about. And I do think that a lot of this with the travelling community comes back to a rational lack of evidence and lack of relationship with that community.
Yeah, Evelyn, do you have complaints from people from the travellers community?
Yes, we do actually have some legal complaints from travellers, in particular in respect of service provision, hotels and pubs, shops, and so on. In fact, a very interesting one recently where traveller women were not served in a mobile phone shop. Spoke to a local PSNI person nearby who said that's unlawful, go and complain to the Equality Commission. So we had a good sense of partnership working with the police service officer, knowing exactly how to advise the individuals. I want to say a couple of things about this because, I mean, obviously the experiences being reported and the attitudes towards travellers are particularly significant, and we know from our key inequalities, and we'll be updating that again shortly on kind of more objective data in employment terms, in educational terms, in mortality terms, in infant mortality terms, in accommodation terms. Travellers are amongst the most disadvantaged in Northern Ireland, and it does seem to me that there's there has been a lack of political will over many years to address this issue. There have been individual initiatives about traveller education, traveller accommodation and so on. There's still a need, in our view, for some joining up of those initiatives, but an absolute need for sustained political will to address these, because in 21st century Northern Ireland it is simply not right that the traveller people are amongst the most disadvantaged.
Okay, thank you. Rory, this is an interesting one. I mean, obviously you've massive staff there, 5,000 people, but somebody has said, this is a general question, obviously not about your company, but how do you go about it? Sometimes discrimination in work may start before people even start work in spite of policies, and how can this be prevented?
Well, I have to say our outreach efforts in the schools, if this is what someone's getting at, does not extend to equality issues, except that we deliver our activities in all sorts of schools. I certainly think, having said that though, there are some programmes I know run by organisations, the likes of Sentinels, where they do work in schools in terms of mock interviews and so forth, and recruitment, and they usually do include an element referring to discrimination and the fact that people will be applying for jobs and will be treated without regard to religion, sex, race, age, disability. I'm not sure if that's
well, I was going to ask Francis then, is that somewhere where the charities do come in, as you said earlier in your talk? It's up to charities to speak up for particular groups that are potentially disadvantaged.
I think very much that's been a role of youth work charities, of which there are a very great many in Northern Ireland, and a lot of them, organisations like Public Achievement, work with the PSNI, they work with schools, they work with young people on examining themselves as citizens and how they relate to each other, and so they would take that with them into the workplace. The whole point of that kind of youth-focused charity work is to try and equip young people for living in a very fast-changing modern society, which is multicultural and multi-relational. And so, yes, that's a hugely important role before people get into the workplace. Also, they'll have been part of many kinds of charities. They'll have been part of churches. They'll have been part of other uniformed youth organisations. They'll have been part of sporting organisations, of music organisations. All those kinds of charities are dealing with people at the age before they're at the age of employment, and are enhancing the educational experience they receive in schools, and actually bringing something to their external lives, which is very much encouraging them to work together and to live their lives in certain ways. So I think that's a huge role for charities here. It always has been.
Yeah. Evelyn, that sort of takes us on, about children and young people. How can we most effectively promote the development of positive attitudes and challenge prejudice among children and young people, do you think?
I don't want to say it's all the responsibility of schools, because clearly, of course, it isn't. And as Francis was talking there, I was reflecting on how different things are for young people in schools now than when I was at school. We have my children at school with people from a wide range of different ethnic backgrounds, and when I went to school, similarly, we have seen the mainstreaming of children with disabilities into our schools to some degree. So things are very different. I think schools need to be supported in driving through the assisting in individual school pupils to understand difference. But it is, I think, changing slowly, and I think there is a need. However, having said that, there is a need, and schools are really at the forefront of dealing with this. We know there are very high instances of bullying based on certain characteristics, including gay, disability, and so on. Schools sometimes address those well, sometimes don't, and we need to both have clear policy frameworks apart from the legal framework which exists, and also support schools with very practical help in how to address that. And I think there's quite a wide-ranging set of work that needs to be done in respect of education to ensure equality is effectively mainstreamed through all aspects of the curriculum, not just lifelong learning or citizenship courses, but through the wide range of the curriculum also.
James Larkin, parent of a disabled child, has asked a question here, which I'll just open to the whole panel. Government policies and attitudes are influential. Do the panel feel that the government's welfare reform has polarised negative attitudes, in particular towards disabled people? Obviously, this debate raging about the changes to disability living allowance that are coming towards the end of this year. Anybody in particular want to look at that?
Well, I do think that what we're finding in the tabloid media coverage and discussion of this is a sense that anyone who defines themselves as disabled is in some way on a scam, and that everybody who has any degree of disability now has to be retested. They have, which. Given that there will be some people who are scamming the system, let's be realistic about it. Yes, that should be dealt with. But the idea that we now have an atmosphere in the country in which people who are at their most vulnerable now are challenged to prove their disability, I think is an horrific thing. And I also recall, though, that it's not just a Tory government thing. It was when Labour came in at the very beginning in 1997, there was a determined effort, I suppose, in the way of getting the unpopular policies out of the way first, to get a redefinition of disability at that time as well. So my fear is that at government level, it's not so much about saving money, it's about deflection from the problems that they have in hand. It's about feeding the tabloid type media a bone to chew on, and allow them to exercise their sense of themselves as being rugged and determined to weed out criminality. But if you are in a society like today, which has been so badly damaged by gambling, among the richest and the most privileged, and the ones who are still getting the greatest rewards. And if you then say that the way to resolve the economy and restore the economy in some way is not to deal with those gangsters, or the banksters as somebody call them, but to actually turn on the disabled and to start means testing them or scrutinise them even further to get money back from them, is an appalling situation.
Fidelma?
I think you'd echo what Francis said earlier, that when money gets tight, it doesn't flow to the most vulnerable. The Equality Commission put in a very robust response to the welfare consultation, and it is horrific what is actually happening to real people. And I think that's it's a bit like what Malachy said earlier on. The media has got the big headlines about the person living in getting 26,000 or 40,000 or 50,000, and people who are on minimum wage are looking at those headlines and reading and thinking, I don't earn that, I'm struggling, and therefore it's very easy to take pot shots at those people who apparently are getting all this money. But behind those headlines are real human stories of struggle, and people making the decision whether or not to eat or heat their home, in terms of older people, but also now not just older people, about whether or not someone with a severely disabled child has a chance to get respite care. And in terms of that, the caring, the value to the state that those carers are providing to people with severe disabilities, if you had to pay for that, the country couldn't afford it. So I think we need to find those human stories. And one of the things that we found out in Unison, that school meals workers were telling us that because of the changes in the working family tax credit, I think it was, there are now children coming up to the school meals workers saying, I don't qualify for a school meal anymore, my mummy said. Now the school meals workers are still giving that child their meal, and I hope there's nobody from the Education Library Board here. But they shouldn't, because that child now no longer qualifies for that school meal. It doesn't mean that the family has suddenly won the lottery and they can afford to pay for it. And that for many children, that is the only hot meal they get in the day. So they're the real stories, and I think we need to really work with the media to pull out the real stories, so that people can relate to what's happening for real people, their neighbours, their people in their communities, and be angry about it. Because any of us could become disabled. We could trip on the way down the escalator and become disabled. And obviously then there'll be solicitors looking for criminal compensation. But any of us could walk out of here and become disabled. And some people in the room have already got disabilities. So it's not necessarily fighting for somebody else, we're actually fighting for ourselves.
Darren, just one point I wanted to raise in relation to people with disabilities or long-term illnesses. Some of the statistics were quite surprising, really, about how they then perceive other groups. And I just wonder, is there any way of explaining that?
Not from this particular survey. Certainly it was of interest to us that different people hold different attitudes and different prejudice, so not one group holds all the negative attitudes. It's important to say that as well. But certainly when you look across the board, those from Belfast, males and those with a limiting illness were coming through as more often than not holding the stronger negative attitudes. But this particular quantitative survey doesn't explore that. But the purpose of this survey is to highlight some of these issues so that we and others can explore it. You know? Yeah,
and it just takes us on to a question that Joe Law has sent up from Trademark. Why do you think there's more prejudice from people belonging to a lower social class? Again, is there an explanation for that?
I wouldn't overly focus on that. Yes, as I said, the different groups have different prejudices, and lower social class came through in a couple of areas, in some areas, but it wasn't coming through as strongly as some of the other ones that I've just mentioned. So I'd really advise people go and look at the detailed report and examine the particular areas and take it from there.
Okay. Richard Montague's got a question. George, this is probably one for you. Does the panel think a lot more needs to be done to seriously address the problem of sectarianism and sectarian hate crime in Belfast? And if so, what should our politicians and statutory bodies be doing to achieve this?
Well, I'm not sure if implicit in the question is something around a legislative fix. Let me just address that.
It's a combination of the two, I think.
Yeah, in case it is. My view would be that legislation rarely fixes these problems. It can constrain and it can affect behaviour, and we've heard a bit about that earlier. But I think it's probably more necessary for those of us within the criminal justice system to use what is currently available in that regard, as regards to the legislation. And sometimes well-intentioned people within the criminal justice system will go for a pragmatic fix in terms of a criminal justice disposal that will actually dilute some of the aggravating factors around crime, so sectarianism or hate motivation of whatever description. So we have currently within the legislative framework specific public order offences, for example, around sectarianism and incitement to hatred and so on. Sometimes, and we need to be careful not to generalise here, but sometimes it becomes more pragmatic for the prosecution service or even for the police in terms of their recommendation to go for an offence which would also be proven by that activity but is not the aggravated offence of incitement to hatred or sectarianism. So, for example, it's much easier and more straightforward and more likely to get a plea of guilty for a disorderly behaviour charge in the generic sense than it would be for one of those aggravated offences under the public order legislation, just by way of example. So I suppose the strategic point in that is that I don't necessarily think we're at a point where we need more legislation. I think what we need is better application of what we've got around the criminal justice stuff. I do think there is a bit of a gap around policy, and in some ways I'm stating the bleeding obvious, because If we look at the controversy in recent weeks around the CSI strategy, for example, you know, that's very frustrating for us as cops, because within that there needs to be a piece of work, and there is actually in the drafts, around flag protocols and who's going to actually deal with all of that, and where in areas where it causes contention. Now, what ends up happening is police tend to be frontline first responders, and we actually get pulled into taking flags down or negotiating with certain elements within communities. It's actually, at the core of it, probably got more to do with local authorities or politicians than it has to do with the police. But in terms of trying to keep good order and take a pragmatic, common sense approach, we get sucked into filling that vacuum. Now, we will do it because it's a good thing to do for society, and we don't always get it right. And you know, the instances a year past around Doak and Ballyclare and so on is an indication of some of when we have got that wrong. But actually, we're filling a gap that is created by a lack of policy, and it's always easy to knock politicians and so on. But our cry would be for the politicians to get on with the cohesion, sharing, and integration strategy. It's not going to be the cure for all our ills, but it actually will fill a very significant gap around this issue of sectarianism and hate crime. So, in short, I think it's a policy fix rather than a legislative fix is what we need, along with the criminal justice partners, ourselves included, using and exploiting, in the best possible sense of that word, what's already available to us, because I'm not convinced we are.
Okay. Evelyn, did you want to come in on that?
Well, it was a very similar point, actually. You know, maybe to say, I think clearly legislation, equality legislation included, gives a very strong, clear signal of public policy intent, and that's important, and the legislative framework is important. Public authorities now are under duties to promote equality and good relations under the Northern Ireland Act, you know, in addition to their obligations under the anti-discrimination legislation. But precisely the point that was made, I mean, we're all waiting for the revised cohesion, sharing and integration strategy to come out. I think that does demonstrate the need for political leadership on this issue. That's really important in terms of tackling sectarianism and the other things that have been mentioned. Some individual public authorities are doing some very good work, but it needs to be done as a coherence across the public sector in a very joined up way, because it's not just about hate crime or interfaith sites, it's also about education and employment and healthcare and so on. So I think we need a joined up approach looking at that, but similar point.
Let's open it to the floor. Anybody got questions from the floor at this stage that they'd like answered? Yes, gentleman there at the back. If you don't mind telling us who you are and which organisation, if there is one that you represent.
Yeah, certainly. My name is Simon McClenaghan from Disability Action. It is a query in relation to disabled people. They were identified as having more negative attitudes than non-disabled people. However, they also have fewer qualifications, are poorer, and tend to be older, all of which are also linked to having more negative attitudes. Can I ask whether those other factors were looked at when making this statement?
Yes, that's obviously you're quoting the factors from the report, so we have individually considered each of those. What the analysis doesn't go on to do is to do a factor analysis below that. Difficult sometimes in terms of sample sizes, but it can tell you on each one of those variables whether that's a predictor or not. So it's not necessarily saying you hold that view because you are disabled. It's not necessarily linked to the disability, but disabled people hold those views.
Did it surprise you, Simon, the statistics that came out?
No. And the reason being is that groups such as disabled people, LGBT people, for instance, are never challenged in relation to negative attitudes that they may well have, because they're actually seen as primarily victims.
Yes, because not to be patronising about it, but is part of the reason that they may have negative attitudes about certain things because they have had a negative experience themselves. I'm thinking of RNIB figures, for people with visual impairment, 80% of adults with visual impairment are unemployed. So you can imagine that that's quite a frustrating position to be in.
Yeah, I mean, that is certainly possible. However, what I am saying is that we have to challenge attitudes like that should we find them. We, however, need more robust data. To quote one of the panelists, there are very, very few studies in relation to attitudes, for instance, from disabled people. Very, very few.
Yes, and you raise an interesting point that people are seen in that sense as victims rather than all people being people underneath it all, and why should disabled people be any different in their beliefs and their held views as anyone else in society?
Yeah, no, that is certainly very, very true, that they are the same as everybody else. You know, there are people who are racist, who are homophobic, like us all. But what I was really pointing out here was that these findings from this study could well be due to other factors such as poverty or other matters, and that perhaps a more in-depth factor analysis might have actually thrown that up. I am aware that obviously sample size is an issue.
Darren, do you want to come back on that, or is that something maybe that you would think about looking a little bit further at, perhaps in some survey in between or in the next survey?
Well, I would reinforce the value of the report as an evidence base. It's identifying that for these groups, they report certain attitudes and certain experiences, so it provides a starting point to go and either further explore why that's occurring to them or why they're behaving in that way. So I think that's the purpose of the report.
Surely one of the considerations, what we're seeing here is that prejudice festers within self-defining groups, if you like, or within groups which feed off themselves. Even when you look at prejudice among children, or you mentioned also the people of long-term illness, and the sectarian issue of communities which are just locked together and which just feed themselves and their own ideas and predominate that it's almost as if the message is quite simple. It's just get out more. That if people could break the boundaries of their own self-defined unit, and interact more. The problem I'm pointing to, so few of us know travelling people, so few, but it seems to be easier to integrate, or at least to accommodate gay concerns, because we all know gay people. And I wonder if with disabled people or people with disabilities, the problem might not be down to something as simple as mobility. That if they're just, if they are, and being part of groups which maybe are just support groups for disabled people themselves, and not seeing beyond that. But yet you cannot be disabled, I presume, and not also have an ethnic identity or a sexual orientation or an age, that puts you in another category.
Yeah. Evelyn, yeah.
That was the point that I wanted to make, actually, and it goes back to some research we did some time ago now, in the early 2000s, with partner equality and human rights organisations across these islands, which looked at multiple discrimination issues and actually looked at gay disabled people and how they were treated both by the gay and lesbians and by people with disabilities and other groups as well. It's available on our website, and it was quite stark, some of the prejudicial attitudes showed by those communities to each other, to those subgroups. So I think there is a lot to explore about what shapes our attitudes and how they're played out. And I think it's a good question to raise, why is that and what are the factors leading to that, and indeed looking at multiple discrimination and multiple identity issues and how we can explore that, which this survey can't look at because of the way it was structured, didn't look at because of the way it was structured.
Yes, Fidelma, briefly. Yeah.
Just a quick, there was a piece of work done which actually looked at lesbian, gay, bisexual community and the various communities in terms of race, Polish, Filipino. One of the issues was that if you came over because of discrimination in your own country and end up in Northern Ireland, you had a choice. You either came out and maybe were rejected by your own community, maybe the Polish or Latvian or the Filipino community, and therefore, or you stayed in and stayed with that community and therefore I didn't get to identify your sexual orientation in a public way. So it's an issue. The multiple identity issue is a real issue for people.
Simon, thanks very much for your question. Yes, just beside you there.
Hello, I'm Mary Query from the LGBT group in Unison, and I'd really like to follow up on the last speaker's comments. And it's, I suppose, what is it that promotes tolerance? And I've just skim-read the report, and I agree with Darren that there isn't evidence that's saying that because you come from a working class community or on a low income, it means you're going to be more prejudiced, because there's a variation within the report. But the one thing, having just skim-read it, which I think is really interesting and seems to be highlighted, is that women in general are more tolerant than men. And that comes right through all the categories, the LGBT, travellers, whatever. So I'm curious from the panel's perspective, what is it? I mean, according to Malachy, does it mean that we get out a bit more than men do? In my experience, that is not the case, and if we do, we tend not to have as much money when we get there. But so I'm curious, what is there? Because there's something quite crucial in this. I do agree with people who are saying that what we need to do is, it's not changing legislation, but we need to actually implement the policies. And I would like to see more people being fined and convicted of race, homophobic, and particularly crimes against trans people. But there is something there as well about being positive, is actually looking at the plus side. How do we promote tolerance?
Frances, do you want to answer that?
Just quickly, one thing that immediately jumps into my head, Mary, is that there's been some academic work done at the University of Oxford by Professor Miles Hewson on tolerance, and they did a really gigantic meta-analysis of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of studies looking at contact, and their policy emphasis at that stage was on community relations, but what they were looking at was what changes attitudes and what promotes tolerance. And what they found was that whatever the contested identity factor is, whatever the contested difference is, has to be upfront in the interaction. It's not enough to rub along with someone and not to know what the difference is. It wasn't a don't mention the war solution. It wasn't enough to take people away and have them just talk about the weather or how lovely the place they were visiting was. They actually had to have upfront interaction on the nature of the difference, why it was contested, and what their views were. And so from all of the studies they looked at, what they found was that the most successful interventions arose from those that foregrounded the difference, those that hid the difference and tried to rely on, we're all just people at base, aren't we? That actually didn't make very much difference at all in terms of changing people's attitudes and building tolerance. So that's one very large piece of academic work I know about, that there is quite a robust evidence base for that.
Thanks. A couple more questions already handed in, then I'll come back to the floor. I come from the now democratic South Africa. I'm not involved in Catholic and Protestant division or differences of this country, but I find that I get labelled or classified by where I live. I'm grouped the same as the community I live among. I feel this is unfair. Why can't I be accepted as neutral, irrespective of where I reside in Northern Ireland? Malachy, I mean, obviously, whatever the statistic is, it ranges sort of from 80% to 90% of us live in segregated communities.
Yes, we all live, or most of us live in segregated communities. We have a problem in that we have a political system which requires that people who participate in it define themselves according to which community they belong to, and yet we also have a growing number of people not just coming in from other countries, but actually who grew up here, who are refusing these definitions. I teach now at Queen's University, and I find that students have a very low tolerance for any discussion even of these issues. They seem to regard the sectarian conflict, we can call it that, as something embarrassing that happened among their parents, and that they don't inherit. I would say, I mean, I grew up as a Catholic, as a nationalist, baptized Catholic, in my early childhood in a mixed estate, but later in a totally 100% Catholic estate at the time of the Troubles, and I have a name which identifies me as Irish and almost inevitably as Catholic as well. And I would have to say to you, I'm with you in this. I feel exactly the same. I find myself all the time refusing this imputation that my political attitudes and my cultural attitudes and my religious beliefs can be assumed from where I live, where I was born, what my name is. I demand for myself and for you the right to declare yourself an intelligent thinking human being who doesn't have a label on his forehead, and the more of us the better.
Evelyn, yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one, and I think it was what I was looking for there. There was one statistic that sort of said sort of Catholics, Protestants, and then people, or nationalist unionists, and then people who didn't want to identify, and then the people who didn't want to identify was actually 30%. And I thought from a politician's point of view, there's some right voters who are sitting there who really do not identify themselves with any of the parties there. So, obviously with some exceptions, but how do you think we will eventually overcome that?
Well, I think it raises lots of interesting questions around identity and how people choose to be seen. I suppose taking it back to what's within the responsibility of the Equality Commission, we have a responsibility to look at the monitoring returns that employers make, nearly 4,000 or around 4,000, make to us every year under the Fair Employment Monitoring Regulations, which does drive people to identify whether they're from the Catholic community or the Protestant community or other. There's high levels of compliance with the monitoring regulations, and we produce the monitoring report every year, which is pored over by many people. We have noticed, and particularly since the accession of some of the EU countries in the early 2000s there, an increase, odd increases in some firms which very quickly changed the balance from Protestant to Catholic inside a year, which clearly related to where workers were being drawn from, particularly Eastern Europeans, who, when asked the question, do you identify, are you from the Catholic community or the Protestant community, actually do tick, I'm from the Catholic community, because that's their religion. But it's not quite the initial purpose of the monitoring regulation. So we have said that the monitoring regulation should be amended to allow for greater diversity of response, to look at also national origin and so on as being helpful as we move into a changing and more diverse Northern Ireland society. That I suppose the other point I'd make is, though, we've been very clear all these years that that data is simply for the purposes of monitoring whether there's fair participation in an organisation or not. It should not be used to treat people differently in any way or whatever. It's a snapshot of community background for the purposes which the Fair Employment legislation was designed to do, to ensure that employers like Shorts Bombardier are focused on the intention of ensuring fair participation in the workplace.
Is another interesting question, which is in some way another quite depressing theme, but let's discuss it anyway. Nandi has said there's so much racism and discrimination towards the black minority in terms of their qualifications and obtaining managerial positions at work. We don't feel that this could ever be resolved, and should this be tackled? If yes, how?
I think yes, very, very much so. I mean, there's clearly an issue in relation to recognition of equivalence of qualifications, and that's a very important one that we can provide advice on, one that we're working with some of the professional recognition bodies in relation to that. But it's not just about recognition of qualifications. We know that people, and we've seen it in the survey, that people have, whether it's because they don't know anybody from a particular minority ethnic community, or whether they have assumptions about their capabilities, their experience, their interest. We know that there are both reported poor attitudes towards people from DNA communities and reported levels of experience. So the more we can raise the discussion about the intrinsic value of each individual, the individual competences that people can bring to jobs, to employment, to public life here, the better, as far as we in the Equality Commission are concerned. And that's really a big part of why we're putting out a survey like this, to demonstrate the importance of that kind of attitudes, experience of, and awareness of. Some of the work we've done over the years has been very important to try to raise awareness of racism in the workplace, or Anti-Racist Workplace Week, or Anti-Racism Month, that we're likely to do again in the near future. It was a very important way of a lot of partners working together to address these issues, and I'm very keen that we would continue to focus as the Equality Commission on really showing that racism has no place in Northern Ireland.
Still more questions. Any more from the floor just at this stage? Okay, gentleman at the back there.
Well, Joe Law from Trademark, and we have also, to back up this type of research, we're a small, we're affiliated with the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, if you like, the anti-sectarian unit. We do a lot of training and a lot of research. We just worked on a report on sectarianism in the workplace. Now it shows a few things. This is from our experience of working in the last couple of years within workplaces, large workplaces. We find a positive thing in unions and management, with both union rep and the management rep we talked about on the panel. When they can work together and people have confidence that if they are being harassed, that they can go to the union and management, and that's a joint approach. That's very good. What we've also found is in small businesses, and most of our business, and most people work in very, very small sort of context, that if they're in a minority, well, they do what most minorities do. They put up whatever happens, and they keep their mouths shut, or they leave. Now that's not monitored. Those people will not come forward to engage with the Equality Commission. They don't have the wherewithal and the rest of it. So those issues, I think, are still there, and it's still, I mean, my own personal experience as someone who worked in shorts in the 80s, still dealing with these issues, hell of a lot easier than it was then, I must say, as a trade unionist on the factory floor. That these issues are still there. The issue of identity in workplaces, the issues of flags and emblems, are still very much there. In the recent work that we have done, we've found not just, as Malachy said, young people blaming it on their parents, it's something to do with them. I've been involved in serious disputes, serious threats in workplaces and in Facebook connections with people, young people who are going through or are finished third level education. But the issue of identity is very strong for them. And when you wear a badge or make a remark, it is about that. So I'd like to ask the panel one question. That's just if anybody wants a copy of this report we've done, I'll have one, so I may as well make a wee plug. But what I'd like to ask the panel, we're coming up now to what we call a decade of remembrance. Is it going to be commemoration or celebration? How will we decide to do that? We've already heard a couple of things recently. Apparently golf clubs are a bastion of tolerance. We don't know what to do with a big deal of ground in between two communities. Again, they'll do some sport in it apparently, and that make it work. And will they or won't they meet the Queen? All those issues that we're dealing with. And now we have, from this year on, from a commemoration at the end of this year, well, every year we have the commemorations that are divisive.
Yeah, I mean,
around the 12th. Yeah. But the commemorations over the next 10 years, how do you think we're fit or equipped to deal with those that are coming up?
Yeah, Malachy, it's going to give you plenty to write about, I would imagine.
Oh, it will surely. Well, we're not equipped to avoid them, so that's one thing. And we've already had the start with the Titanic, which appears to have been a multicultural, equal opportunity sinking, you know. I noticed when I was around the City Hall, there is one O'Doherty on the list of passengers who died. I agree with you, Joe. I mean that it's potentially a difficulty, but it just has to be seen as potentially an opportunity as well. You know, we have seen some degree of opening up of the discussion, for instance, around the Battle of the Somme and the Ulster Division and the nationalist participation in that. We've seen Dublin getting more concerned to acknowledge the role of Irish people in the British Army, even now regarding the Second World War with the pardoning of the deserters. But this year we have the Ulster Covenant and the Home Rule Bill. Doesn't seem, I mean, have I got the dates wrong or something? But you would have thought there would have been a bigger fuss about all of that at this year. The big one will be 1916 with the Easter Rising and the Battle of the Somme. But at least then in that there's something for everybody, isn't there? You know, our lot can have the Rising and their lot can have the Somme, you know. I think the truth about our history is that it is so much more complex and interesting than the units or the bigots or the communities who define themselves by it would have us understand. And therefore I think that the closer you look at the history of Belfast, the closer you look at the Easter Rising, the closer you look at the Somme, the closer you look at the Irish War of Independence and so on, and all those issues in the Civil War, the more the more untenable becomes the superficial understanding that this was just our lot. Therefore, this actually might be a very good opportunity to go in close and look in a sharper focus and see the assumed parameters breaking down and the complexity emerging. Who knows?
Evelyn, do you want to make a comment?
Just to add to that, and I'm sure some of the other panel members want to say something too. I mean, clearly identity is a very important issue for everyone in Northern Ireland. There's no doubt about that, and we have seen over the years identity issues being discussed at local council level in an ongoing way, including recently Belfast City Council. I agree with Malachy. We're clearly not equipped to avoid the next decade and all the potential opportunities there are there for difficulty, but they are also opportunities for dialogue. I do think, and we had in the Equality Commission, advice being sought for us over how service providers, employers should be dealing with celebrations around the Jubilee and display of flags and so on. Those are important issues for people. There are some frameworks within which discussions can take place, and I would say I'm a little bit optimistic that there is some political dialogue going on also at the Assembly about how to accommodate these. I think what's important is, though, not to get where Malachy's got to, one for you and one for me, that it has to be a dialogue based on how can we better share Northern Ireland, how can we better both celebrate and commemorate things that are important to many people in Northern Ireland.
And we've just over 5 minutes left. Any more questions from the floor, and then I'll take one more. Just this lady at the front here.
Hello, my name is Bree Lavery from the Northern Ireland Housing Executive. The question I want to ask is it enough that employers like large employers like ourselves are complying with the law by employing 5% of disabled people? Furthermore, are they just paying lip service to that figure? And also, why are they allowed not to actively promote training and opportunities for disabled people within the workplace and provide good access routes for disabled people down through the building in the case of fire or any other alert? Within my own organisations, courses are being delivered and are not put into an alternative format for deaf employees. And even though this has been brought to their attention 6 months, 12 months, 18 months down the line, they still haven't delivered compulsory training to those employees. While it is their duty to do so, to provide reasonable adjustments, this is not happening. And furthermore, as a trade union rep and a disabled champion in our organisation, I'm being queried as to where I'm getting my findings from and have I shown them to anyone else. So are we... do I, as a rep and a disabled champion, feel under threat because I bring it to the attention, speaking for a minority group within the organisation who have no other voice except for myself? Thank you.
It's a very interesting point that you raise. I think rather than get into the particulars because you've identified the organisation, you can talk to the Equality Commission afterwards about that. But it's so important, and I think we all probably find this at one stage or another in our place of work, that it's that fear factor, isn't it? You can perhaps see somebody above you operating in a way that is discriminatory to whatever group, but you think, oh, can I go and say, how does that affect my job? How does it affect career prospects? And fear seems to underlie most of this in terms of actually being brave enough, as Fidelma put it so well at the beginning, and saying when they're out of the room, you need to be the one standing up and being brave. So, Evelyn, how do you think we get to that stage?
I was going to maybe suggest that Rory said something as an employer who mentioned the word zero tolerance. I think employers do have to show, I've talked about political leadership, employers also need to say very clearly there are behaviours, there's circumstances in this organisation that we won't tolerate being treated unfairly. I think taking a serious, sustained look at disability access is important by employers proactively and not just necessarily responding. But Rory might want to say something about that too, so I don't hog the floor.
Well, without in any way wanting to touch upon the organisation, I think it is about escalating, if there's a process within the organisation to escalate the issue beyond the immediate manager if action isn't being taken. And that's, it's easy to sit here and say we have a process for that. But I dare say someone could say the same thing has happened, sort of the experience you've given, the same thing has happened within our organisation. But we like to think that there is a process for people to move on to a higher level to make sure that attention is brought to bear. We have our own occupational health department. Sorry, there was a bar shutting. Sorry. We have our own occupational health department, which means we have an in-house doctor and nursing staff. So there is another sort of a route. If a manager isn't progressing, then people can, of course, approach their trade unions, but can go through our own occupational health to try to do some of it.
Fidelma, you obviously represent trade union as well. It is difficult for people who don't work for organisations that has a strong trade union.
And I think that's why we've got the Equality Commission, because not everyone is in a trade union, not all employers. A lot of employers do not recognise trade unions, but people can still have the right to have a trade union rep in the room with them, even if the employer doesn't recognise them collectively. But the Equality Commission is here for those individual complaints, and certainly I think a conversation is required in terms of how you tackle that, because workers are entitled to mandatory training. Mandatory training is to safeguard us as the recipients of those services. And when workers aren't trained properly and don't receive the right level of training or at the frequencies required, and then a mistake is made, then it's a member of the public or a client or that actually suffers. So it's in our interest to make sure that all staff are properly trained and supported in their workplace. And the other thing is that when people aren't properly supported in the workplace, particularly if it's issues if people feel that they've been treated less respectfully than other members of staff, then that means that can cause anxiety, it can cause mental ill health, and it often means that staff member ends up going off on sick leave. And most people want to be at their work, they want to be happy at their work, they want to get paid fairly for a fair day's work. So it's important for us to make sure to support people to do that. So I think definitely it's an individual conversation, but the Equality Commission is there for individual complaints about any of those issues and can provide advice, and if we need to go down the legal route, then certainly we can look at that as well.
Just time for that one final question, please, from the floor.
Yes, I'm Jennifer Clifford. I'm from the Oysters Group. I'd just like to ask Malachy again. Sorry, Malachy.
By all means.
You said in your introduction about how the media or medias can take some credit of how attitudes have changed in society. I'd just like to pose the question that we also take the responsibility for the negative stereotypes that were formed about the transgender community, especially by the tabloid press. Have you any thoughts that perhaps the inquiry by the Leveson inquiry might allow them to change their mind about these stereotypes? And I will admit that the media does promote positive stereotypes, but for the poor trans community, we've not seen a very great deal of evidence.
Well, the other side of the coin of what I was saying about them having a responsibility is that they would, they obviously have done damage. Again, you're agreeing with me that it's a diverse phenomenon in the media. It's wide, and you can't tar everything consistently right across from, say, public service broadcasting to shitty tabloid. But they have done damage. I remember times when transgendered people who were seeking surgery, for instance, one of the routes towards being able to fund that was to sell their story. And this was done even on the Sunday News when I worked on the Sunday News. And I remember this man who would come in, when he hadn't gone to the stage of coming out in the way he was dressed, but and how this was sniggered about in the office, and how the negotiations were conducted about how much money you could get from the story. But so it was regarded as just a salacious story, that this person had gender difficulty and needed correction surgery for it, We've moved from that, but I think we should. The media needs to understand that it has an historic culture. That it has its own background, its own baggage. That it has come out of a past with assumptions that have had to be educated and had to change. And some of them within that, like people perhaps even in the earlier story we were talking about, will grudgingly concede that they ought to make some concession to something, while privately saying among their mates that this is what they would call political correctness gone mad. I mean, how many times have we heard that? So on that score, yes, the media has been part of the problem, and a big part of the problem for transgendered people and people with gender difficulties and sexual orientation difficulties, and should acknowledge that. And then you take it to the Leveson inquiry. Well, I think the Leveson inquiry, the big concern at the heart of the Leveson inquiry is invasion of privacy, you know, and that has brought out stories around sexual conduct, sexual orientation, the right of privacy to your own life and your own character, and I think that's where Leveson will, I presume, you know, define the need for change, you know, in terms of that. So if we get a regulated media coming out of it, it's more likely to be a media which is regulated in some measure by privacy laws. Within the broadcast media, you have other considerations about balance, you know, and in some ways it might even be easier to make the case for representation within the broadcast media rather than within the print media. But so that's my answer to you. Yes, the media has been part of the problem. Yes, an educated, thoughtful journalist should be aware of the history of newspapers and the history of journalism and how it has impacted on people. And it's with that awareness of the history that they might have the humility, if you like, to consider these things more thoughtfully now.
Thanks very much.